All right. I wanted to give a quick introduction. This is our first Interviews Day. I asked my friend Mr. Arave to speak to you guys. I'm going to turn the time over to him to speak about how life is and language in the real world. So I really appreciate you joining us, and then we'll do some questions and answers after we're done with you. So
cool.
All right.
Fantastic. Yeah. So man, it's been about 3 years since I've been called Mr. Arave. You guys can call me Wade if you'd like. I'm okay with that. So my name is Wade. My history and my background is pretty diverse. So I have a bachelor's degree in directing, like theater directing, and then I have a master's degree in screenwriting. And about 3 years ago, I got out of education. I was teaching, which is how I know Mr. Einfeldt. We were teaching at the same school together, and I got out of public education and got into higher education. And so now I work as a recruiter for Southern Utah University. I was at a smaller institution prior to that. And strangely enough, the skill set that I learned on stage and doing drama and in screenwriting, there's been a pretty direct correlation between that and what I do now as far as recruiting students, marketing to students, talking to students, all of that. And so language is hugely important in our everyday lives. It's what we speak, how we use the language determines a lot of what the rest of our lives look like. It's how we're influenced, it's how we're affected, how we are effective, how we influence others. And so language becomes extremely important with both like self-talk, what you think about yourself, also with how you talk to your friends and your family, even down to the emails that you write, the text messages that you write, and the ads that you read. Language is hugely important in all of that. And so those are just a few things to keep in mind. I've got some notes. I'm just going to be looking down, so don't think that I'm not paying attention to what's going on.
Well, the same thing for me. I'm over here. I'm live tweeting it. So
awesome.
So everybody don't think that I'm just checking my phone or checking how bad I beat Braxton in fantasy football. It was by 19 points, but you know who's counting. So.
No doubt. Cool.
Braxton's in the class, so that's why.
Oh, good. Way to call him out then.
Yeah.
So one thing that I want you to understand is that everything you do is communication, and language is the basis of communication. There is other aspects of communication as far as like body language goes, but we rely on communication, verbal communication, written communication heavily. And so everything that you do, whether you realize it or not, is extremely communication oriented, communication heavy, right? I remember as a freshman in high school, me confronting my English teacher and telling her, I will never write again after I graduate from high school, which was a lie. And not just because I went to college, but because of, again, emails, letters that I write. You write the way you think and you speak the way you think as well, right? And so if you can write well and think well, then you'll speak well. And so your communication will be clear and concise. And like I said, everything you do is communication. And I mean, even you guys now, so like Twitter, text messaging, things you write on Facebook, memes that you create, right? Like all of that is a very specific kind of communication, and you're putting words together in a very specific way in order to communicate something to someone else so that they're on the same page as you, right? Like it creates a connection that you have with that other person very quickly. And that's the whole point of communication, right? And so there are basically two kinds of communication. There's direct communication and indirect communication, right? And I've kind of lived in both worlds for a little while. And so what I do mostly now is direct communication, right? So that's in emails that I write to students. That's in brochures that I put together, text messages that I send out, even to the point where we put together some presentations and we write out a script of that presentation. I also write a blog about relationships, and that's very, very direct communication, meaning that I don't beat around the bush of what I want to say. I call out exactly what the point that I'm trying to get across to the people that I'm communicating to, right? So when I'm talking to high school students, direct communication is really like, when you're choosing a college, you need to think about more than just program. You need to think about like where it's at, the people that you'll meet, the professors that you'll talk about, the professors that you'll work with, the research opportunities that are available, the internships opportunities that are there. Like you want to think long-term when you're deciding on a college. And that's very clearly understood, right? As opposed to indirect communication, which I'll get to in just a second, which is more like allegory and storytelling and things like that.
Which one did you say you would use more often, indirect or direct?
So we use both. I use direct more often, and it's used for very specific purposes, right? Like direct communication is very logical, so it appeals to your logic brain, and so as you process information, direct is really nice. Like a lot of nonfiction books, like self-help, things like that, personal development, all that stuff is very logical. It's very direct communication, right? Like if you want to improve your health and fitness, here are some very specific tactics that you can use, right? You need to change your diet. You need to work out 3 days a week. You need to, walk more regularly. You need to drink more water. Like there's no miscommunication in what you have to do in order to get the results that you want, as opposed to indirect communication, which is more emotionally based, which we do use in recruitment, but for very different reasons and very strategically, so that it drives the point home, and lasts longer with the students that we communicate with, right? So let me explain direct communication, then we can kind of compare and contrast the two. So indirect communication is more storytelling, right? So that's movies, fiction books, short stories, YouTube videos, emojis, right? Instagram is very emotionally based in indirect communication. Not that has to do with language per se.
Oh, it does. It does.
Sure. You're telling a story, I guess, in a still image, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are really direct communication, and they appeal to our emotional side, right? And so the benefit of appealing to your emotional side is that you'll remember it more, right? Like, I don't know if you remember not this last Super Bowl, but the Super Bowl before that, where the Seahawks actually won. Taco Bell had a commercial that was phenomenal, and they had just relaunched their branding of Live Moss instead of Think Outside the Bun.
Uh-huh.
And it was a retirement home. So it was like this retirement home, and there's all these old people going to bed, and then the next shot was them sneaking out and quote unquote living moss, right? And so there was like them running away from the cops and like sneaking into clubs and getting tattoos and like totally living opposite of what you expect from a retirement home, or like a 90-year-old to be living like, right? And the whole idea behind it is that it's emotionally driven, right? Those are things that you want to do as a kid to live a full life, and very opposite of what you would do as a 90-year-old. And so you remember that because of the story that it told, right? It's the same reason why like nursery rhymes or stories, right? You learn The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? And you know The Boy Who Cried Wolf as soon as you hear it because of the story, and then you remember the lesson because you remember the story, right?
Yeah.
You don't just cry out because you want to cry out. You cry out for a reason, so that people don't listen, so people don't stop listening to you, right?
Well, with Taco Bell, they almost have to like do it emotionally driven, because logically speaking, it wouldn't make any sense to put it in your body.
Right.
So using direct reasoning wouldn't make sense. Anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so those are kind of the difference between direct and indirect, right? And so we use indirect communication when I talk to students, mostly in storytelling form, right? So I talk a lot about my experience in college. So a really good example of that is that students there's a lot of pressure for students to decide on what their major is when they graduate from high school. But statistically, that's not going to happen, right? So direct communication is, the statistic is 80% of students who graduate have no idea what they're going to major in. So that's something that they can logically understand, right? And then I go on to tell the story that my first year in college, I changed my major 6 times.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was all over the board, right? Like, started out in public relations, went to English, went to filmmaking, went to art, went to psychology, and, you know, through all these things, and then finally settled on theater. And so they logically understand, like, oh, I don't have to have a major. And then they emotionally connect because they're like, oh, this guy changes major 6 times, so it's okay if I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. Right?
I did it 3 times.
Yeah. And that's really typical.
Yeah, I went psychology, and then I went accounting.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I took about 1 semester of accounting. I was like, yeah, no.
Yeah, right. It was a good idea, and then
yeah,
execution was not awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so those are kind of the two. Two forms of communication that we use, that I kind of use on a regular basis. And then what's been awesome is that because I studied theater in college and taught for 3 years, and then have a master's degree in screenwriting, which is really storytelling. I mean, we break down story structure. You talk about character development, and particularly in screenwriting, our professors really kind of drove home the idea of, like, well, what are you really telling? Like, you have your surface story of what's actually happening, but what are you telling underneath that story? What's the point that you want people to walk away from when they walk out of that movie? How do you want them to feel, right? Which is why when you go and see a good movie, you think about it for weeks, right? It sticks with you. It stays with you, and you keep coming back to it, and you're like, oh, I get that. I understand that. There's a new level of understanding of what it is, and you connect with it on a much deeper level.
Right.
Right. And you've probably experienced it. How old are you guys, by the way?
These guys are seniors.
Okay, so you've definitely experienced this, which is one of the things that I always hated, right? Like, which, Mr. Einfeldt, I'm sure you can relate to this as well. Like, you've read a book in school, and the teacher's like, "This is the greatest book in the world," and you're like, "I don't get it."
Here's my example. Everybody loves The Great Gatsby. I think The Great Gatsby is the okay Gatsby.
Sure. And I felt the exact same way, right? Like, there's so many books that I read in high school that I had to read, right? Because to pass the class and to get through it or whatever, and I couldn't stand them, right? And I was just like, what a worthless book. I don't understand why my teacher loves this book so much. I didn't connect with it at all. I just did the assignment to do the assignment, right? And then fast forward 7 or 8 years, and I pick up the book again, and I get why the teacher did it.
Right.
Right. And so what you're doing is you're mixing those 2 kinds of communication, right? The book itself is indirect communication, which is why people get a lot out of it. But what your teacher is doing is trying to take indirect communication and put it in direct communication, which is contradictory, which is why so many people hate the books they're forced to read.
Huh. I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So they're, you know, let me shove the meaning of this book down your throat. Because that's what it means, and that's what you should understand. And so, I mean, and so we don't like to be told what to do, and so we fight against all of that, right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, kind of an interesting concept. Yeah, and so what's cool about indirect communication as well is that, and just like I said, like when you go and see a movie or you read a book that you're not forced to read, you think about it. You think about it on a regular basis, right? Like you think about when you're when you're in the middle of another activity, right? Like you're thinking about it when you're working out, or you're walking to school, or between classes, or even when you're in the middle of a conversation. And and so what it does is your brain automatically processes a lot of that information, because that's what our brains are set up to do. You're not being forced to think about it. You just like let go and let your brain process the information.
Yeah.
right? Which is kind of a weird concept because we're always taught, like, you know, think before you speak, and why don't you use your head, and you know, like, you need to sit down and brainstorm these ideas. And so we get forced into this position where it's like you have to use your brain, when the reality of it is that your brain functions on its own, right? And your brain has the ability to process information and will continue to process information even when you don't. Which is why if you talk to, like, which I don't know if you've heard this study technique, but like one of the things is to really study hard before a test the night, like right before you go to sleep.
Cramming.
Not necessarily right before the test.
Right.
But like if you study right before you go to sleep, then your brain attaches onto that information and you internalize it better because your brain is still processing the information.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
And so if you guys are willing, this might be a little bit weird. The exercise works a little bit better when I'm with people. But we can try it. It's gonna feel a little bit weird because I'm a drama kid and I get up and move around a lot, and sometimes the games I play are a little bit weird. But I want to prove this point to you that your brain processes information without you knowing it, right? And your brain will start to make connections without you understanding, okay? Without trying. So what I want you to do is you're going to get up and walk around the room, and you're going to point at stuff, and you're going to call it what it is, all right? So let me give you a real quick example. So I'm in my car right now because I'm traveling for work, driving up to Salt Lake for an event. So as I point, right, like phone, steering wheel, stereo, seatbelt. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Very cool.
All right.
So we'll do it for about 30 seconds. I know it's gonna feel weird. Just go with it, all right, and trust me.
All right, ready, go.
Bobble.
Okay, 5 seconds, head back to your desk. Very cool.
Cool. Weird game, right? So that was phase 1. We're going to go to phase 2. So now we're going to do the same thing, but when you point at something, you're going to call it what you previously pointed at. All right? So I'll show you another example. So this is going to use your brain a little bit. It's a little bit more difficult, right? So I'm pointing at the phone, but I'm not going to call it phone. And then I point to the steering wheel and I say phone, steering wheel, stereo, seatbelt. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
Very good. So another 30 seconds. Let's try that again.
There you go.
Door. Bobblehead. Left. Mackenzie. No, I can't. Phone.
Okay, 10 seconds.
Yes.
Okay, 5 seconds, head back to your desk. All right, cool.
Very cool. All right, so now we're going to move to phase 3. This one's the most difficult of the 3, but it's not that difficult. You're going to walk around, you're going to point at things, and you can call it whatever you want as long as you don't call it what it is. Okay? So, like Battleship, George Clooney, chicken pot pie, radishes. Make sense?
All right, here we go. 30 seconds, go.
Tomato. Sausage. Pancakes. Bookcase. Library.
Okay, 10 seconds.
Pumpkin turkey.
5. All right, cool.
Very cool. Okay, so just by a show of hands, how many of you guys categorize? We're listing in a category, right? Like farm animals or food or football teams. Just by a show of hands.
Hey, raise your hand if you did.
You can't even see this. Yeah, this side is more than that.
Oh my goodness.
So that side of the room. Yeah, good. Okay. Good. So what that proves is that because you guys, the assignment wasn't categorize everything, right? Like you just automatically categorized it, right? And so you would automatically start listing things in a category until you got to the end, right? Like farm animals, you had chicken, cow, horse, dog, pig, and then you're like, I can't think of any more. Let's switch categories. Football teams, right? Patriots, the Packers, the Cowboys, the Seahawks, whatever, and then you couldn't remember anymore and you switch categories. So your brain automatically makes connections, right? And that's why indirect communication is so effective, is because not only do you hear it, understand it, and listen to it, but your brain starts to process it, particularly when you're doing other things. And so, which is why a lot of people have a hard time with school, is because school is very direct communication, right? And you're forcing your brain to try to internalize a lot of information, which is why you need to study constantly and like looking at your notes all the time, especially if you have like an anatomy class and you have to memorize all the bones, right? I don't know if you've had to do that, but you have to look at it constantly because your brain isn't internalizing it as well and as often as indirect communication, because you've stopped paying attention to it, but your brain holds on to the story. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, cool.
Yes.
Cool. Very good. And so those are kind of the two communication styles that I deal with, and I use both of those communication styles in everything that we write. So whether that's brochures, emails, text messaging, or presentations, like we use each of those, which is interesting, right? Especially when you're writing an emotional email about a very logical decision of going which college to go to or the best college to go to, right? But it all plays into that.
How emotionally driven is that decision for most students?
You'd be surprised. So it's about 80% of students make a decision based on the advice of someone that they know and trust, right? So that might be family or friends, and that's because of personal experience, right? Like, the parents, which this is really typical in the state of Utah, like parents are really diehard BYU fans, and whether they went to college at BYU or not, they might be so, watch all the football games, they go to the events, everything is so BYU driven that the kid grows up saying like, that's the only place I'm going to go to school, right? Unless, of course, they can't get the grades to get in, and then they got to figure out something else. But it's extremely emotional, right? And it's one of the reasons why we try to encourage students to get onto a campus, because when you go to a campus, you get a feel for what the school is going to be like. You get a feel for like how you're going to fit in, what are the other students like. And that's completely emotionally driven, right? Because you're going to spend 4 years at that institution. It becomes your home. And you want to make sure that it feels right, not that it's just the best logical choice.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Did we touch on all the stuff that you were hoping to hit on, or you got more?
Yeah, that was it. So I'm open for questions and
okay.
Q&A. If you guys have questions, that would be awesome.
All right, do you have anybody that has some questions that they didn't write? Okay, I know I told them before we got on about the fact that you do some blogging. If I remember right, you did some stuff with Off the Cuff. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, could you explain what that is to them, and maybe that has a lot to do with communication as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly indirect communication with yourself. So, my training theatrically is actually in improv.
Mm-hmm.
My high school drama teacher was a professional improviser. And then as I went through college, I got hooked up with some more improv, some people that did improv. And in Cedar City, there's a professional troupe down there called Off the Cuff that I performed with professionally for 6 years. And it's improv is a great example of how you communicate indirectly with yourself. And so the way improv works is that you want to get out of your own way, you want to get out of your head, and you just want to start talking, which is scary, right? Like, you get up on stage, you're there to perform, and all you're given is a word or a strange suggestion, like a song lyric or something like that, and you're expected to create a scene based on that suggestion. And what doesn't work is when you approach the problem logically, right? Where you start to think like, okay, I have to force myself to think about what that means, what is my experience around that topic, and how can I create a scene and a relationship with another person on stage surrounding that topic. Because if you approach it that way, you working on your brain isn't going to work fast enough in order for it to work. And so you need to let go and just let your brain find the connection that's going to come up. And now it's hard to trust that, but it's magical and it works extremely well.
Awesome. All right, so I'll go over some of the questions that I had them kind of put some together here. One of the questions was a big one that I get all the time, which is how much of the stuff that they're learning, the question is, how much of the stuff we learned in school and high school actually applies to the real world?
Everything. I know that's probably like the generic answer that every teacher tells you, but everything applies. And this is why you might not like. So I wasn't smart enough to take calculus, right? And you might not directly use calculus in every day, right? Like, I have no need to know the process of calculus. I got as high as college algebra, but the skills that I learned to process college algebra, I use every day on a regular basis, right? So if I can kind of use the college algebra analogy or the algebra analogy, right? Like 3 plus x equals 7, find out what x is. That kind of problem solving is every day, right? Like that's every day. It might not be as linear as 3 plus x equals 7, but as you're problem solving,
Right.
you will attach onto that, right?
Right. So we're thinking almost more like metacognitively, like the learning process itself and the problem-solving process itself is what you use.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other thing too is speaking cognitively, there's this thing called lateral thinking, where what you do is, instead of thinking logically in order vertically, you think laterally, and so you reach outside your topic and you try to grab information from an outside topic that would be helpful for the subject that you're in. And there's a really good photographer online named Chase Jarvis, fabulous photographer, really cool guy. Had the opportunity to meet him a couple of years ago. And he runs a show called Chase Jarvis Live in his studio in Seattle, where he does exactly that. So he does lateral thinking. So he reaches out to guys or people, because they're not always guys, reaches out to professionals who are not in photography to come and speak about what they do, and then they draw connections between photography and that other subject. Right? So one of the coolest ones I watched was, he had a guy on, I'm gonna forget his name, but the guy runs a CrossFit gym in San Francisco. He has a PhD in physiology. He's like cutting edge, movement oriented, and so he's really like the top professional in how your body moves. And his kind of belief system is that we should be living for 150 years, but the reason we don't is because we move wrong. The way you walk, the way you sit, the way you stand, the way you shake hands, the way you eat, the way you do everything kind of screws up your joints. And so that adds extra pressure, causes and causes just a ton of problems. And so our body deteriorates before it should, because we are not in proper position.
Huh, that's interesting.
And so they spent an hour talking about this, and they're like, cool, how do we apply this to photographers? And he was like, think about how you take a picture and the weird positions you get in to get the right shot, right? And you're doing a lot of moving around, and the way that your hand holds the camera and the way that your shoulders sit and everything, that is knocking you out of alignment. And so if you do that, like, your body is getting beat to pieces. And so he taught them techniques to kind of get into proper position so that they can come back to that position when they're not necessarily shooting and when they're just doing normal. So they have a healthier life, a longer life. They can create their art a little bit longer as well.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, so that lateral thinking, the more that you can connect subjects to to each other, the better it's going to be.
Okay, cool. All right, next question we had was, let's see. One question, a couple people asked, how did you get your job? Or when did you know that you wanted to do this, and that whole process?
Sure. I didn't know that I wanted to do this. So kind of what happened to me was, I got my dream job right out of college. I wanted to teach drama. Loved every minute of it. And then because it's an art, and an expensive art at that, like, theater is not a cheap thing to participate in or to teach or to start a program. The school that I was at cut funding, and because theater isn't necessary, they basically said you have a part-time job. Well, I have a family and a mortgage, and I couldn't make a living on $15,000. And so I was, which was a crappy experience. Like, you never want to lose your job, right? And but what it did was it forced me to start thinking laterally, right? So I started reaching outside. I applied for a couple of other theater positions, but I started thinking, like, okay, where are my connections? What do I have an in at? The skills that I learned in theater, what would I be good at? Experience in education. So higher education made a lot of sense, and recruitment made a lot of sense, because it's presentations, it's working with high school students that I already knew, and plus I had a couple of my friends were recruiters. My brother was a recruiter for a while, and so I got into it. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did, but I got into it. Found out my skill set was perfect for it, and I love the work. I love the work that I do. I love to work with students. I love the challenge of coming up with new communication plans every year. How do we focus on the student? What are the trending, how are the trends changing so that we can relate to the students a little bit better? I love the work that I do. It's meaningful because my college experience was so life-changing for me, that I'd like to help students find that. Like, my college experience really helped define who I was. And that's one of the benefits of college. And then I blog on a regular basis, and that kind of gets some creative outlets out that way. Now that I'm back in Cedar City, I do stuff with off the cuff every once in a while, and that kind of meets that need as well. So
that kind of leads to another question. Somebody asked, because I mentioned some of the hobbies that you do with your blogging and whatnot. How busy are you when it comes to, in life in general, when it comes to your hobbies? How do you find time to be able to do all of it?
You just make time. If it's important enough, you make time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't watch a lot of TV. I make sure that my time with my kids is really, really focused. I try to stay present as much as I can. And sometimes it sucks, right? Like, this last weekend, I did an intensive retreat, which was three and a half days away from my family, and it was completely personal, right? But it was awesome. It was just an opportunity came up that I was able to do it, and my wife understood that. Like, she understood it was important for me, And that's how it worked out, right? Like I'm extremely busy. I mean, I put out a blog post every week. I do a weekly newsletter. I'm on social media for my blog all the time. I'm constantly working on the communication plan, so sending emails out to high school students. I oversee about 5 recruiters, regional recruiters, so Ogden, Salt Lake, Provo, a couple that are in our office in Cedar City, and then one in Las Vegas. So I'm constantly talking to them about, you know, their goals that they're trying to meet, new techniques that we're trying, plus staff meeting, plus some administrative duties that I have on campus. Like, I'm busy, but that's where you want to be, right? You want to be busy because it's creatively stimulating. It's exciting to be a part of. It's cool. It's cool to be busy. It makes life fulfilling.
All right, let's get one more. Does anybody have a question that they're just thinking of now, since he's been talking at all, that they didn't think of? Okay, so I didn't ask already. Let's see. Okay, when it comes to your job as a recruiter, what are some of the things you look at? And I wanted you to I want to see if you could maybe touch on what you said. You said how college defined you. Like,
sure.
For me, that's the same exact thing. Like, after teaching, this is my 5th year teaching high school. I tell my students all the time, you know, high school sucks. College is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for me, college is that. If you can get through high school and get to college, college is the best part because of all the great experiences you have there. College, I learned more in college in one class than I think I did in all of my high school life. So, I had a class. You probably know him, but I had a class with Todd Peterson. Do you know Todd?
Yeah, I do know Todd.
Yeah, Todd pretty much changed my world. So,
awesome.
So anyway, if you kind of touch on that, a little bit about college and how influential it is and what you look at for recruits.
Sure. So it's the problem that you're running with high school is the same problem that we talked about with indirect and direct communication, right? Like, there's very specific classes that you have to take, and you're being force-fed all of this information, right? Like, forced to take this down, forced to swallow this. And of course, every teacher who is passionate about that subject is like, you're going to learn, you're going to remember this for the rest of your life. You're going to use this. You're going to rely on this information. And then while you're in it, while you're in the trenches, right, it's hard to see outside the world. It's hard to see outside the world, right? The outside world, because all you're seeing is the 4 walls that you live in. And so you don't really see the connection because you're just force-fed so much information that your brain isn't making any real lasting connections, right? And so college eliminates that. Nothing is, you have to have certain classes in order to graduate, which is true. But after you get those out of the way, you're just taking the classes that you want to take because you want to take them, right? And so you start to find the connections between everything, and all of a sudden your world starts to expand, and you experience things that you wouldn't have experienced otherwise. You meet, professors that you wouldn't have met otherwise. You meet students that you wouldn't have met otherwise, and they invite you to do these incredible things that you wouldn't have done otherwise.
Do you guys recruit? Sorry, do you guys recruit much, or when you do your recruiting stuff, do you talk much about the EDGE program?
Yeah, we do, which is a hugely beneficial thing at Southern Utah University, which is unique to AR campus because we're the only school in the country that's doing it, and we've had a lot of, like Harvard, Stanford, a lot of like Brown, a lot of top institutions, including the U, come down, observe our program, and try to implement what that is.
I've tried to do it a little bit in my classes. We call it 20% time, but basically it's essentially the same idea. Sure. And anyway, I just think it's fantastic what you guys are doing with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead and explain kind of what it looks like,
well,
and what it is?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, I mean, you've got a captive audience for like college recruiting now. So there you go.
Put in my 2 cents. Yeah. So the EDGE program is a program that's required by our students where they have to reach out into the community and produce a project that has to do with what they're studying. Right. So, but not necessarily directly connected. So we have a nursing student on campus this year. She graduates in the spring, and last year she went to Dubai for an international women's conference, right? Because she was studying feminism and kind of women's rights and women's liberation and all of that. And this opportunity to go to Dubai came up. And so she went with 4 or 5 other women, and they went to this week-long women's intensive of how women's rights are changing all over the world and what they can do. And she got involved in these projects that kind of supported this conference in Dubai, right? And then you also might have projects that are directly connected to what you do. So we had a student who went down to Guatemala, I believe, and did a research project based on sea turtles. And so she spent 2 weeks down there finding where these sea turtles nests were all along the beach, and they would record how many sea turtles came out, how many eggs there were, how many got eaten. You know, they measured the sea turtles to see the health of the sea turtles, all of that. And so, and so she has a biology degree, and that there's a direct connection there. But on her own or any other institution, would she have gone to Guatemala, set up the project, invited the researchers down there, and run everything, right? And so when she graduated, like, not only does she have the degree and the regular research experience, but she has this whole project under her belt that she knows how to organize, she knows how to lead, she knows how to do those linear activities of communication, you know, project management, project development, execution, all of that makes her an extremely sought after employee.
Right. I again, like I said, I just think it's fantastic. When I saw that SUU was doing that, it was, I hate to say this like this, but it was like one of the first moments that me as an alumni that I was like really, really super proud of my college for doing.
Yeah. Good.
I mean, the football teams, okay, you know, basketball teams had it taking its lumps and everything, but like that was just a moment when I saw that post, I was like, yeah, my school did that. So
yeah, awesome.
But anyway, does anybody have any more questions? We have about a couple minutes left, so a couple things I've got to do. But anybody have any questions for Wade? No. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. I know you're extremely busy. And thanks for all you do for students there at SUU as well. So
yeah, and I was gonna say what I'll do, Mr. Einfeldt, is I'll send you my contact information if they want to follow up with me at all, or if you have questions about college, even if it has nothing to do with Southern Utah University, let me know, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have and kind of help you steer in a direction of program or where you'd like to go.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, Wade. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll see you guys. Have a good one.
All right. There we go.